Hello everyone and welcome to Inspector Goals, where we try to improve our FPL play through a more analytical approach. My first time saying that intro. Luke normally does that, and that's because we've got two new hosts this year. One of them is Seb Vassal, who's recording with Luke next week, but we're also joined by Ben Crellin. Ben, how are you doing, mate? Really good to see you.
I'm doing well, thanks. Thanks for having me.
It's all right.
How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm all right, thanks. Yeah, I'm doing well. It's like a real pleasure to have you on because obviously you're very well known within the FPL community. I had a little look earlier. You've got 6 top 10k finishes in the last 8 seasons. Is that right? Is that up to date based on last season as well? And then eighth in the all-time rankings as well.
Yeah, I think so. It's a bit false though, isn't it? Because all these people who started playing 4 or 5 years ago using analytics, they'll be ahead of me soon, won't they? When they have more seasons under their belt.
I don't know. I wouldn't be so sure. I think you're probably doing yourself a bit of a disservice there. But I've got a lot to thank you for in terms of, I think even like 5 or 6 years ago, like winning mini leagues with mates before they were aware of who you were, where you would go into the end of the season and have all your chips left and just follow like your tables and put together a good chip strategy. So much of that is based on following you on Twitter. But now it's harder to win mini leagues because you're so well followed that all my mates who even play casually are like aware of who you are. And now know to save their chips till later. You obviously did really well last season. Did you play differently at all last season, or has it been pretty consistent like the whole time you've played FPL?
It's been pretty consistent, I suppose. I've got more into analytics every year maybe, and last year was my first full year using FPL Review. But I don't know, my rank is kind of 5k-ish, and it's kind of similar to how I've done in previous years. So yeah, I mean, I was flying high in the middle of the year and then kind of tailed off a bit. There was a time when I was top of all mini leagues, but I didn't finish this season strong and just finished just outside the top 5k. So I was pretty happy with that.
Yeah, you should be very happy with that. I mean, I remember seeing early in the season you were like in the top 1,000, which you've never finished top 1k.
No,
appalling. Shocking. But I guess by way of introduction as well to anyone who's listening to the podcast for the first time, I'm quite similar in the sense that I just started getting into analytics like 2 seasons ago, used it for the first time and had a really amazing season, finished 1.8k, and then last season I finished 51k. So I had an okay season. I think that's like quite a good season, but now I think because I engage with lots of like analytics managers on Twitter who all get really good ranks, it doesn't feel that good. But similar in terms of not similar in terms of my rank history by any means, but similar in terms of when I got into review. And I definitely wouldn't consider myself to be an expert at all when it comes to analytics, but kind of learning as I'm going, to be honest. And what were kind of your initial reactions to the game, Ben, when it was released in terms of prices and things like that? Is there anything that's kind of stood out this season for you?
Well, when it was first released, I didn't really get straight into studying the prices. I just waited a bit. I had a proper look. Well, maybe over the last few days, I've really got into it a bit more. And you know, the prices are kind. Like Saka seems way underpriced because he's an elite forward in one of the top teams. Salah is kind of fairly priced, but he's a bit of a question mark. Like depending on how good you think his fixtures are. And Haaland is a no-brainer. There's the forwards, the pricing is a bit kind of stretched out. There's not many kind of mid to high priced forwards, are there? You have to kind of take a jump down. So that's affecting the structure of drafts you can make as well. And there's some good value defenders.
There's a huge gap, isn't there, between like Rashford at 9, or who else is at 9? Son, I think. And then the strikers who are like 8 or 8.5, like Watkins, Jesus, and then the next jump up's massive to either Salah at 12.5 or Haaland at 14. And that's the one thing is like the whole game, the players are all way too cheap, to be honest, in terms of if you want to make a competitive game. But I completely get why they do that, and that's nothing new either. Like they do that to includes, it improves interaction and engagement in the game. So I get it. But I think the thing that I feel like they've got wrong is that all those midfielders that are like 8 to 9, Rashford, Saka, Martinelli, Bruno Fernandes, I feel like if they were all like 1 to 2 million higher, there would be way more decisions to make. And I've been playing over the last couple of weeks. Been playing the Women's World Cup fantasy game on She Plays, and like it's really highly priced. So I'm in a group chat with a few other people, and our teams are all so different. I think that's made me realise just how much better it would be. But we'll get into the season, and there'll be a lot more variation between teams as we go. Anyway, that'll just happen naturally as players get injured and people wildcard at different times. So no, it's nothing new that there's a template around this time. And it made me laugh, like just before we started recording, you said to me, "Oh, it's a bit early to be doing a draft, really, and we're only a week out from the season starting, and there's probably people listening to this who are been sharing drafts on Twitter for like the last 6 weeks or last month, however long the game's been out." But you're right.
I notice people suffer from burnout during the season, don't they? And they get sick of it, and I just think you want to keep yourself fresh and only put time into building drafts when it's productive. And if you're building a draft 3 or 4 weeks in advance when you don't know about injuries in pre-season and who's nailed, then it can be a bit of a waste of time.
Yeah, and to be honest, it's even just with what happened yesterday and last night with Chelsea and Arsenal playing. Suddenly Jesus is just not an option for game week 1, and Nkunku might not be an option for game week 1. I don't think we necessarily know yet. Even just things like that could change in the next week, or Community Shield result or lineup might change your thinking.
Yeah, I just made my first draft properly last night, and I'm now already thinking that was a waste of time because of the injuries. And drafting 2 or 3 days in advance. If you're like me and you don't have a full-time job and you can just spend a few hours on the final day or the final couple of days, that's kind of the best way to do it, I think.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. But also, if people want to make drafts earlier and that's fun, then absolutely they should do it as well. Yeah,
that's fine. Yeah, if it's your main hobby and you've got nothing else that you can enjoy doing with your time, then go ahead. Yeah.
That sounds so brutal. Is there anything, Ben, when you were making your draft last night? Are there any kind of general principles you always follow in pre-season going into game week 1?
General principles, kind of hard to think. You want to obviously concentrate on the teams with the best fixtures early. You don't need to invest too much into your subs bench. I don't know. I guess I get more focused as I get closer to the deadline and have a better idea of what I'm doing. But this far out, what do I think? I don't have any specific things that I focus on apart from trying to get good fixtures, good captaincy options in the first few weeks. Yeah. You don't really want to be planning transfers, I don't think, but you can have a few players whose fixtures might tail off at a certain time that you can be thinking I might sell one of these players if they're not performing, and maybe have an idea who you might want to bring in. But yeah, it depends. Every season's a bit different with which teams have got good fixtures to begin with and which teams have got new managers, and it's always a bit different. Yeah.
And so basically keep it simple is what you're saying. For me, I find that first, the idea of a weak bench, I find that a really interesting discussion point, because in general, if you look at players who are heavily into analytics in terms of FPL, they like a really strong bench, and it isn't necessarily that they like to, although it's helpful to, that they like to be well set up for when a player does get benched. Because actually it's always surprising to me how little I do use my bench in general. But it's more that it buys you time. So if you get to game week 1 and then suddenly, I don't know, let's say you've got Martinelli in your team and he gets injured game week 1. If your first sub is a 4.0 defender from Luton, you're going to be wanting to make that transfer to take Martinelli out in game week 2. Whereas if your first sub is Chilwell, for example, and you've got a couple of players who are 5 or 5.5 that might be rotating from first sub to starting, you can then delay that transfer by a week, and suddenly you've got 2 transfers, and just that flexibility of 2 transfers and an extra game week of just knowledge is just so valuable. So, but I just find that hard to kind of get behind early in the season, because I just know the likelihood is I'll wildcard really early. Well, when I say really early, in the first 8 game weeks at some point, because that normally happens. So I kind of am more prone to just want to take a bit of a gamble and only have as long as two of my subs play, if they're both 4.0 players who are defenders for bad teams, I don't mind too much. But I don't know if that's me playing the game wrong. I don't know if that's necessarily a good thing. I just think it's an interesting point of discussion, particularly if you feel like it gives you an upgrade in your team that's significantly better as well.
Yeah, it's like when I first ran the review solve last night, and it had me having a really stacked bench with only one cheap 4.5 forward, but the other two spots were good players, good options, and I was thinking I don't really need that. You only need maybe the one good first sub who you kind of be okay having to start every week. And yeah, when you've got the wild card in your back pocket, and it's the first wild card isn't as useful as the second wild card. You can wild card if you get into injury problems. It's not too much of an issue. Yeah,
sure. And I think in general it's just a helpful point to make at this stage as well. So when it might even be worth explaining what FPL review is, because there'll be people listening who might not be aware of that. So FPL review is probably the most well-known, or one of the most well-known FPL models. So it gives you advice for your team. It puts values on players in terms of predicted points for every game week, and therefore you can get it to suggest transfers for you, for example. And that's exactly what it is to me. It's a way of, it's like having a friend to run your team by and get their opinion on. However, it's just going to be extremely objective. So a lot of people use that to play the game. And yeah, I like to, again, because I know I've got all sorts of biases when I watch football. And even when I look at data, I'm going to kind of be prone to taking what I want to take out of it rather than what it might be saying. That's why I find models really helpful and find FPL review really useful, is because it gives me an objective prediction for players, and I think it's a really helpful way to play the game. And what you were saying there about, it might suggest you have two really strong subs, but you disagree with that for your team structure. That's the kind of thing that's helpful to discuss, where we would decide to go against it, for example. And I think that's the basis of, I like to use review as the basis of my team. And then my question I ask myself is, why would I go against that? Is there a reason why I think actually that player is going to play less minutes than review thinks as the default expected minutes? Or is there a structure issue? Or is it early in the season and therefore I need more flexibility, etc.? So that's what I find really helpful, is asking those questions and not always just going, we should never just go with what a model says just because that's what it says.
Yeah, it's it's using bookies odds, isn't it, a lot? And you normally want to trust the odds and the data, but there's occasions throughout the year where you just have a strong opinion that you want to go with, and that's fine. I don't think you want to be going with your own opinions every week, because most of the time the model is going to be more informed than you are. But just a few times you need to just get in and just do what you feel is best yourself. But I suppose every decision, it gives lots of different options for transfers, and it shows little marginal gains, and sometimes there's nothing between them, and you'll scroll down until you see the transfer that you like best. You're not always going to go with the transfer that it suggests top. Definitely not.
No, and I just find it helpful to just pick up on things that, if there's a transfer I'm considering or a player, and then I go and review and they're absolutely miles off an alternative at a similar price, that'll just make me rule out that player, to be honest. So if there's a huge difference, I will just use it to make that decision, because ultimately, yeah, it's better at predicting football than I am. That's what I think. But yeah, when it's really close, that's when we need to bring our own intuition in. And if it's a difference between 0.1 EV, which is expected value, so expected points, that's when we just need to, you might disagree with it. And a lot of that is minutes, to be honest. And what you mentioned about using bookies odds, they all assume 90 minutes. So particularly for goal scoring or output, you definitely need to apply your own thought process, and actually how valuable is that data if it's assuming 90 minutes and we think that player is actually to be benched or going to play 60 to 70 minutes. Hopefully that's a helpful intro to people, I guess, who have never kind of used FPL review. And if you haven't used it before, they have a free model that you can try out as well, so give that a go. I'm just going to move over to a slide here where you can see that this is actually from Ben's spreadsheet that he creates, when you can just see the fixtures. I guess kind of the same initial question I asked before, Ben, around kind of initial thoughts on the game. What are your kind of initial reaction to the early fixtures and what teams to target and those kind of things?
Well, the Arsenal players who are underpriced already, and they start with good fixtures, so
Yeah.
tripling up on Arsenal seems kind of straightforward. Well, you definitely want Saka, don't you? And we'll talk about the defenders in a bit. Man City, their fixtures are pretty good, so you have to have Haaland, and then you try and get a nailed defender, and maybe you gamble on a midfielder. And Liverpool are mixed. It's like they're not terrible fixtures. There's reasons why you'd want them, and then there's tough away games. The 4 of their first 5 away games are difficult, so it depends on when you'd wildcard with them, and if you can afford to stretch your budget for Salah, or Alexander-Arnold. And then you've got Brighton and Brentford, who are good enablers because their fixtures are largely good. And then Chelsea's got 2 really good home games in the game week 3 and 4. Maybe you want to wait. Maybe you could target that as a first transfer in. It depends if Nkunku is fit to start. But for the likes of Chilwell and James, it's like a question of, can you risk starting with them? Do you wait to see how they perform in the first 2 relatively difficult games and then transfer?
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. I think Chelsea are a good example where if you, for example, look at Chelsea's fixtures, they've got Liverpool first, then West Ham, then Luton. If, for example, you just switch the Luton and Liverpool fixtures and they had Luton first, then West Ham and Liverpool, they'd be so, like, James and Chilwell would be way more highly owned. But actually, that's not necessarily that doesn't necessarily mean that people are wrong now to not have them if they don't, and they would if they were playing Luton first. It's more that, that it kind of just buys you time to make that decision and see them play. And if suddenly they only start 1 out of the first 2, suddenly you're more put off by them. But it's a lot easier to buy your time and make that consideration when their fixtures are worse. Whereas if you risk it and go without and they've got Luton first and suddenly James gets a 21-pointer, suddenly then you've kind of missed the boat. So I think it almost provides an opportunity. And just another general thought is that, like you said, the good teams have good fixtures in general, particularly City and Arsenal. And it was the same thing last season. I remember this time last year sitting down with Luke and we discussed that the template was really strong because actually I think at the time it was City, Liverpool, one of the other big teams had the best fixtures. And I guess, I mean, you'll probably know the answer to this, Ben. Is that there's a lot of that to do with scheduling in terms of, do the TV... is it because they, games get the most views around Christmas, so that a lot of those big games are likely to be during that period, or is it just random and it happens to be the case for the last 2 seasons that those bigger teams happen to have easier first fixtures, or is there something in that the bigger games are maybe saved for around the Christmas period and later on in the first half of the season?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's all about Christmas, but they maybe they don't want to use it up the really top 6 clashes. They don't want to put too many of them early on because teams aren't firing on all cylinders and it won't be as entertaining. So I think they do tend to push them to the middle of the year. Yeah,
because I've just really noticed that the last 2 seasons, and I guess it allows more time for narratives and storylines, etc., to build. And then Man City versus Arsenal, rather than just being the 2 best teams playing each other on the first day, it's suddenly, Arsenal are 3 points ahead of City, for example, after 10 game weeks, and now they play each other, and that's suddenly more exciting because is it more within context? But yeah, there were my initial thoughts as well. Were triple Arsenal, although even now Jesus is injured, maybe that's even in question. Trying to decide whether I go with the Liverpool player or not because again their opening fixtures are pretty good. And then City are just so interesting because you'd look at that, and if you were the kind of person who'd never played FPL before but you're a massive football fan, you would look at that and think, if you're playing a fantasy game, you just go 3 City players. But it's just it's so much more complex than that, as we know because of Pep essentially rotating players. So I think that the fixtures almost make an even stronger template. Is there any kind of time that stands out to you there to wildcard, or do you try and not think about that at all and just save it for as late as possible?
Well, you've got the blank coming up in game week 18. So, if you did save your wildcard,
I didn't even know that. Game week 18.
Yeah.
Club World Cup or something like that, is it?
Club World Cup, Man City against Brentford. It's not a major thing. I mean, I can scroll along on this. spreadsheet page, and they've got like Luton away, Palace at home before the blank, and then Everton away, Sheffield United at home, Newcastle away, Burnley at home after the blank. So if you wanted to carry three Man City players around that time, then you might want a wild card immediately after the blank, like and sell two. But that's only a small kind of carrot or whatever you want to, a small temptation to save your wild card. You're not going to get into too much trouble if you need a wild card early. And looking at the fixture swings, you talked about game week 8 being a good time to wild card, haven't you? That looks pretty good.
Yeah, that's just, I just find that so funny that you're thinking 18 game weeks ahead.
Well, there have been times in previous years when there's been like a big blank game week in game week 18. I can't remember when it was, and that was like a major reason to save the wild card.
Yeah.
But this time it's just a small kind of thing that it could be useful at that point.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting to know. Like, because I think last year, I can't remember, but last year I'm pretty sure there was a game week where I think it was maybe the first international break or second international break. It was like a really obvious time because there was a huge swing. But maybe this year there's not so much an obvious time. Yeah, the reason I said game week 8 is because for those listening, particularly who aren't looking at the fixtures, Man City from game week 8 play Arsenal, then Brighton, then Man United, and Arsenal play Man City, then Chelsea, and then they've got Newcastle 2 games later. So it's just that those two teams where you've got expensive players, that might be the time where you transition from money out of Haaland, for example, into Kane or into Salah, for example, because Liverpool's fixtures are good around that time. Or that might be where you go from 3 Arsenal players to 1 or 2. So that was just my thought there. And I've kind of got that in the back of my mind and kind of thinking about planning for 7 or 8 game weeks. But yeah, I think it is important to be flexible as well, because and it's also just not being stubborn about, I'm definitely going to wildcard in this game week, but also not being stubborn about holding it if you just need to early on. If you realise you've made mistakes or some new information emerges, that's where it becomes really important.
Yeah, I agree with that. There have been times, the last time there was a Club World Cup blank because of an English team winning the World Cup, again, it was just a small blank and a double game week shortly after, and I did save my wild card for that. I don't know if it helped out that much. I think it was Liverpool. Remember the Liverpool season when they had the Club World Cup and then they played West Ham, and I did use it to load up, but it was such a small thing. But often you've got such a strong template and you find your team is fairly settled that you don't need a wild card, and you can manage a little fixture swing like the one in game week 7, 8, 9 if you just save your transfers. So yeah, if you're not having to put out fires, this kind of fixture swing that we can see is kind of manageable, I think, with 3 transfers.
Yeah, definitely. I do think that regardless of whether you wildcard or not, like if Kane stays, which I know is a big if, I think the chances are he probably leaves. But that the fact that from game week 8, Haaland's got Arsenal, Brighton, Man United, and Kane's got Luton, Fulham, Crystal Palace. Like that just seems like such an obvious switch, doesn't it? But it's just a big
if you look at Man City's fixtures beyond that, like it's like Arsenal, Brighton, Man United, then Bournemouth in 11, which is difficult, but then Chelsea, Liverpool, Tottenham, Aston Villa away. So it's
really? Well, I didn't realize.
Only one easy fixture between game weeks 8 and 14 or 15.
Yeah.
So could you even be tempted to go without Haaland in that time?
Yeah, I think so. I fancy it already. 8 game weeks in advance. Great. Shall we move on to let's move on to just going through the players. I guess we thought we'd just, because it's the kind of first podcast of the season, rather than share drafts, what we're going to do is we're going to go through position by position. I've created some tables of who I think are the most relevant players for those positions with some data, and then we're just going to go through and discuss like which players we really like, which players we'd avoid even though they're popular, and discuss minutes a lot and those kind of things. So we'll just do that, and then next week I think when Luke and Seb record, which will be the evening before the game week starts, I think they're going to go through like actual drafts, whereas this is going to be more big picture stuff. So here, what you can see here is basically a table for goalkeepers. So for those listening, what I'm showing is a table where you can see the keepers down the left-hand side. And there's, I think, about 10 of them there, maybe 11 or 12. Their prices. There's then their team non-penalty XG conceded per 90 last season. So that's the amount of, basically how big were the chances that their team conceded last season in terms of underlying data. You've then got X-Mins, which is their predicted average minutes per match, according to the default on FPL review. So we'll discuss whether we agree with those or not. And then what I've put is their expected value for game weeks 1 to 4 and then 1 to 8. And the reason I wanted to include both those is because of what we've just discussed, I guess. It's kind of, we want to be looking big picture in terms of, I think 8's probably a good number of game weeks. I mean, you can go further than that, but I just think there's so much uncertainty with things just changing with injuries. It's kind of maybe a bit foolish to plan beyond then, and maybe even as far as 8. But ultimately, we want to put a bit more weighting on 1 to 4, just because we just know for certain, almost for certain, our team will be used during that period where you just never know. You might end up wildcarding earlier, and then suddenly planning for game week 6, 7, 8 was suddenly pointless. So you can see 1 to 4 and then 1 to 8. So the interesting thing, I think, straight away with goalkeepers is that when you run a solve on FPL review, Edison comes up quite consistently within drafts. But actually, depending what settings you apply to it, how many game weeks you apply, actually you see quite a big mixture in terms of the keepers that come up. But yeah, the big thing that a lot of people would question is the inclusion of Edison, particularly given how horrendous isn't even an over-exaggeration, but horrendous he was last season, not just as an FPL asset, but as a player as well. Is like just conceded so many goals from shots he should have been saving. Don't know, what would you go for Edison, Ben?
I don't think so. Does he get many like bonus points in games? Does he?
Not really, no.
Does he ever haul? He doesn't.
No, not really. There was a couple of times last season where he was actually on for like a 10-pointer when he conceded really late, which made it even more frustrating. But actually, generally, like, he doesn't get a lot of save points, obviously.
Right.
So you've got way less chance of like a double-figure return.
Yeah, looking at the seasons, I've just got the season history. He's made consistently like 50, 60 saves every year until last year when he only made 46 saves. So the saves are way down. I don't know if that's just a change in system or if he's just been a poor goalkeeper. I don't think that it's all about being a poor goalkeeper. That I think it's like a 25% drop in the number of saves that he made, and he only got 8 bonus points. He normally gets 2 to 6 bonus points. So
yeah.
You're not getting much extra from him.
And even if you look at his analytically look at his EV across the first, let's say, 8 game weeks, it's about 5 points higher than, in fact, let's say 7 points higher on average there than a keeper that's 4.5. So actually, can you squeeze out an extra 7 points elsewhere by putting another £1 million into your outfield? Yeah, quite possibly. So for me personally, I've definitely not ruled him out as an option, because I feel like there's a lot of bias in terms of how often last season he conceded late goals. And I do think he's a good option at the beginning because of their fixtures and the fact he's nailed in the Man City defence, and they're ultimately the best defence in the world. So I've not ruled him out. I've not decided yet, but I actually do think he's a good option. Whereas I like Edison. I think it's probably a bit of a misconception that analytics players always have Edison, but actually we tend to like him when he's got double game weeks, like most people do. And the reason why most of us had him towards the end of last season was because of that, and at the beginning of the season, and particularly at the beginning of the season, because there's often a keeper who's 4.5 who's just like a standout keeper for the whole season. Last season that was Raya. In years gone by, probably most significantly was Martinez that year, where he was just unbelievable, was getting 9-10 pointers regularly for 4.5. But it's just really hard to know who that keeper's going to be now. So you either gamble on a keeper who's 4.5, like Pickford for example, knowing that they could get like a couple of 10 pointers, or they could just get, lose games 3 or 4, can concede 3 or 4 goals, or you just go with Edison, where it's probably more guaranteed consistent points and probably the most chance that he'll get the most points compared to other keepers individually, but there's probably less chance that he's going to get 10 and 12 pointers. So yeah, you can take the gamble on the 4.5, and suddenly if Everton keep 3 clean sheets in their first 4, like, that's just unbelievable value for Pickford. Is just a bit more unknown, I guess.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like, Man City's fixtures are so good in these opening 6 or 7 weeks. So if there's kind of like ever a time to have Edison, it might be now, I suppose. if you're going to have triple Man City, you have Haaland. The next best is probably Diaz. Like Diaz is probably like a bit better than Edison, just the same price and like more upside. But then like your third Man City spot, maybe you do go for Edison instead of a gamble of midfielder. I suppose it depends what happens in the Community Shield and who's going to start on the first Friday night. If we get team news for that, like we can talk about that later. But Alvarez could be an option, Grealish. But yeah, Edison might be a good option if you're tripling up on Man City.
Yeah, I think that's actually, this is probably the position where there's just so little in it. Like I just think, particularly if you make the decision, I'm not going to go for Edison. I'm going to go for a keeper who's 4.5. If you look at the expected value and just in general, based on what we know about keepers, for all those keepers on this table, which is Steele, Pickford, Flecken, Leno, Johnston and Fabianski, between the best option and the worst option, if you have all their X-Mins at about 90, there's like 3 points. Like that's it, if that. The only reason Fabianski's significantly lower on this table is because his X-Mins are lower. But again, you're probably not going to, if you pick him, you're probably going to pair him with Areola, and you'll be getting Areola's points anyway. So it kind of is 90 minutes effectively. So there's just such little difference between the keepers. And just in general, we know clean sheets are unpredictable, and probably like one or two of these keepers will randomly make a pen save, which we can't predict in the first few game weeks. So it does feel like a bit of a, if you're going to go with one who's 4.5, just going to go with your gut. And actually, it's interesting, like Review really, really likes Kepa, but with them now signing Sanchez, like I'm pretty sure like Sanchez isn't going to suddenly come in as first option. I don't think anyone's expecting that, but ultimately it's competition and from a very good goalkeeper. So it just feels like a bit, maybe like an unnecessary risk to go for Kepa, and maybe similar with Ramsdale with them signing Raya as well. Don't know, what do you think about Onana?
Is he going to make Man United's defence a lot better? Is the question. Like their defence wasn't that good last year, was it?
No.
They've got two tough away games in their first 4 matches. So is that an opportunity to get more save points and potentially get a haul? He could just get 2 pointers against Spurs and Arsenal away. Yeah. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you there. And people will hear you say that and say, like, what do you mean? They got the most clean sheets. But if you just look at goals conceded, you don't have to look at the underlying data, just look at goals conceded. They weren't anywhere near the top of the league. They conceded plenty. They just had a lot of games where they like conceded 7 against Liverpool, for example, and then they randomly got clean sheets. But also, if you look at the underlying data in terms of chances conceded and on here, non-penalty expected goals conceded per 90, they're at 1.26 per 90, which isn't particularly good at all. It's like, again, exactly the same as Martinez at Villa. Like, their defence isn't that good. Like, I don't think to justify going for a keeper who costs 5 with those fixtures. And I think if you've got Onana and then they happen to concede against Wolves, suddenly you've got a keeper in your team who's got Spurs, Arsenal and Brighton in 3 out of their next 4, where probably none of them you're expecting a clean sheet. And I just think you should probably expect similar. Like, he will be slightly higher on bonus, I think. I saw some analysis that it was either Adam or Baker from the Above Average podcast. I can't remember which one of them did the analysis of like bonus point likelihood. And yeah, because he makes so many passes, he probably is more likely to get bonus points. But in general, in terms of conceding goals, most of that comes down to chances conceded. And he might be a slightly better shot stopper than De Gea, but I think you should probably expect a similar amount of clean sheets as to when they had De Gea in goal as well.
There aren't many better shot stoppers than De Gea. Like De Gea's problems with passing out, and that's why they've got Onana for the passing. So I'm not sure if he's going to make more saves than De Gea. He might not need to make as many saves as De Gea because they might control possession better this year.
Yeah, I mean, do you have a preference in terms of like Steele, Pickford, Flecken, Johnston? Who did you have in your draft last night, for example, that you made?
I had Flecken.
Yeah.
I think I've seen some data about like Brentford. The average distance of the shot is further away, so they're more likely to concede like good savable shots, and he can rack up save points. That's what happened with Raya last year. Will he be as good as Raya? Don't really know until he's played a bit, but yeah, I think I prefer Flecken out of the 4.5s, but I haven't looked into it that much yet.
And he seems based on what I've read and from chatting to Tom from he's a like Brentford correspondent for Planet FBL. Like he just doesn't think there's any threat to his minutes because they're back. They've got obviously Reyes left, but he thinks it's pretty clear that Flecken's now first choice. So yeah, I think now if I had to guess who I go with, I think I'd probably end up with Edison or Pickford would be my guess. But another thing I would say is if you're going to go for Steele, if you don't want Steele, don't let the reason be that you've got a Stupinan. I think like don't be put off double defence just because it's double defence. If you think he's the best keeper, go for him and try and ignore the fact you have a Stupinan instead. You just need to compare him to the other goalkeepers, even though it feels like brave doubling up on a defence. Like most people have a Stupinan anyway. It's just one extra player, regardless of who you go for. So I think you've got to try and ignore that as well. Yeah, sorry, we just randomly just lost connection there. So sorry for the random transition that you probably just got if you're listening to or watching this. Ben, I guess we were just finishing up anyway. Do you have any kind of like final thoughts on keepers before we move on?
Just with the X-Mins that you can see there, they're either going to be 90 or 95, I suppose, if we get a bit more stoppage time, or they're going to be nothing yet. They're either nailed or they're not. The X minutes becomes more important as you like switch to defenders, and then especially with midfielders and forwards who aren't nailed. But yeah, it's a bit more simple. And like Fabianski, I don't know, the reports that Areola is going to be the league goalkeeper. But
I guess the good thing there is that Areola's 4.0. So if you go with Fabianski, you just go with both, don't you?
Yeah.
So then you're sorted. Yeah. The only last thing I'd say is, although I said, you know, that if you're going to go for Steele, ignore the fact you have a Stupinan. I do think you have to take that into account if you're trying to cover a defence for some positions. So what you mentioned in terms of comparing Edison to Diaz, for example, I think if you're going to go for Newcastle defence, suddenly like Pope's just like suddenly a really bad option because he's so much more expensive. Is he 6, isn't he? No, he's 5.5. You know, the same as Edison, and you've got like Botman at 4.5, who's as nailed, is going to get the same clean sheet points, and actually has some attacking threat for a whole million cheaper. So I feel like that's just completely ruled out Pope, to be honest. But I feel like they also kind of had to do that with his price based on how good they were defensively last season as well. So I guess our summary of our thoughts there are maybe me more so than Ben, but go for Edison, or we agree, between those 4.5s there's not a lot in it, but probably Steele, Pickford, Flecken, maybe Johnson. Like their defence was good last year, you can make a good argument for lots of them, but it's one not to overthink, isn't it, the keepers?
Yeah.
Great. Moving on to defenders. Again, for those like listening in, we're showing exactly the same data. We've just got there again, instead of expected goals and expected assists, we've just got those as expected goal involvement here. So that's the two combined, just for sake of fitting it on the table, to be honest. I guess the big question straight away with defenders that everyone had as soon as the game came out, and that was people were really split on, that people are probably less split on now, is whether you have Trent in your team. Don't know, what are your thoughts on that, Ben? I know you said you didn't do a draft until last night, but had you thought about that before last night?
I had a bit. I was more tempted to go for Salah than Trent, I think. We're a bit unsure about their defensive capabilities without Henderson and Fabinho, and having a different defensive midfield, having Chelsea away and Newcastle away early on. I'm not sure, but it might change if all the forwards are injured, like Nkunku and Jesus. You have to change your system. Maybe you do find you have 2.4 lying around to upgrade a 5.5 to Trent, but I'm not like trying to get him into my team, and just maybe I will do if it suits.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, particularly if like a good cheaper striker emerges to downgrade Jesus to. Or if you're going to go have Jesus and Nkunku, then they're both out, then maybe that's a way you try and upgrade your team. For me, I had like Trent in my team the whole time, but I basically made a draft as soon as the game came out. Then I just didn't look at it at all until like a couple of days ago, and I'd had Trent in my team the whole time. This is probably a good example actually of a decision where I've just really let FPL review impact my thinking, which I think is a good thing, because as soon as I looked at those first 4 to 8 game weeks and saw that his EV is actually just really similar to Chilwell's, for example, and actually less than Trippier's over the first 8 game weeks, and the fact his price is 8, that just immediately put me off him actually. And I think there's also, like, it depends on your read in terms of his position. In the last game, he did play right back, and Seb did a really good analysis on his Scoutcast, where he compared Trent when he plays defensively in the midfield role to playing as a fullback, and his conclusion was that he's far better option attacking wise when he's playing as the fullback and crossing from those positions that he's so dangerous in. So it also might depend on your read on that. But yeah, I initially thought that 8 was like a really good price for him. I'm now more thinking actually maybe it should have been 7.5 because of how cheap some of the other defenders are. But this can all change very quickly, particularly with how injury prone James and Chilwell are. And I think they're like a big discussion point as well, because they're both like so attacking. So you can see on here, like, Chilwell 0.23 goal involvement per 90. So you'd be expecting a goal or an assist every 4 games on average. James as high as 0.29, and actually a decent amount of that is goal threat as well. James, he does have shots. Like, their attacking threat is incredible, and they genuinely have the potential to get you, like, if they get quite lucky, they can get like 2 assists and a clean sheet in the same game. But it's just they're just so injury prone. And I've got bad experience, particularly of James, which makes me more like to go with Chilwell. I think, even though he's had like one major long term injury, but doesn't have the same kind of consistent niggling injuries that James has. So I'd be more confident with Chilwell out of those two.
Yeah, and with Mason Mount leaving, do you think they're more likely to get even more set pieces between them? They could just share all the set pieces. Like, is there any midfielder that Chelsea have who's gonna take them?
Particularly in pre-season, Chilwell's been taking a lot of free kicks and corners. I'm not sure about James. I just saw an analysis on Chilwell yesterday. So yeah, he was already taking some, I think, but they'll probably take more of those as well. There's even that like distant dream of the fact James might one day take a penalty, which I don't think will ever happen. Just because I think it was mentioned once by probably like Graham Potter or something. But yeah, they're both like really attacking regardless of that. And yeah, I prefer Chilwell, and it's just if I could guarantee they were both fully fit, I'd have James. But it's just a minutes thing in terms of I just trust his fitness that slightly bit more.
Do you want a squad where you can like leave Chilwell on the bench in game week 1 and play like your 6.5 midfielder ahead of him and the rest of your defenders?
This is where I have that decision, to be honest, that I mentioned earlier about like that dilemma between whether I go for a good first sub or not. Because if I do, yeah, that's what I'll end up doing. I think it will be Chilwell, and he'll be a sub in the first game against Liverpool. And then we'll rotate with like a cheaper striker, for example. But actually at the moment I don't have any Chelsea players in my team, and I've just got a really cheap bench. But I don't know whether I'll hold my nerve on that. Because yeah, again, that allows me a better striker, which we'll come to later. But yeah, they're good options. A lot of it just comes down to like risk appetite, how much you're willing to risk, and they're the kind of players where I'd really consider actually who are the other players you have in your team in other positions. So say, for example, you've already got Foden and Stones. Yeah, they're probably good examples. Maybe even like someone like Mitoma or March, where there's like the potential they could get rotated, particularly Stones and Foden. And, maybe then don't go for Chilwell or James, because suddenly that's like 3 or 4 players in your team that could be rotated in the same game week. Whereas I think if you've got other players with more secure minutes, that's where I'd be more likely to go for them. I guess particularly with like someone like Stones, where he's another defender who could, I think people expect him to play most games, but he could randomly be rotated. If you lose Chilwell and Stones in the same game week, suddenly you're relying on both your sub-defenders. So I would let kind of the expected minutes of your other players come into the thinking with those two.
Yeah, I agree with that. You can take a few more risks early in the season because you've got your wild card, but you don't want a scenario where you've got 2 of them missing in a week, like you said, and having to go to sub 2.
Yeah. But I would at the moment I don't have either of them, but I wouldn't be surprised come game week 1 if I've got Chilwell in my team. But I think it's a really brave move to go for James and Chilwell. And in my opinion, that then needs to be a back 4, just because I think Gabriel and Estupiñán are so good as options. I don't know. I was actually quite surprised when I saw Gabriel's EV on review, because his X-Mins are at 86, which is high. But his EV is only 14, which is like similar to, for example, only slightly more than Luke Shaw over that period. it's a lot less than Luke Shaw over the first 8 game weeks. I was really surprised by that, given Arsenal's fixtures and given Gabriel's attacking threat. So yeah, I'm trying to work out what the reason for that is. I don't know what your read is on that.
Could it be the defensive data in the last few weeks of last season? Did they decline a bit, maybe?
Yeah, maybe. Or maybe it's just particularly those fixtures in 4, 6 and 8. They've got Man United, Spurs and City. Maybe. I just wonder if it's more to do with clean sheets or whether it's undervaluing his attacking threat. I don't know. Or maybe I'm undervaluing Shaw's attacking threat because he played at centre-back so much last season, whereas now I think we're probably expecting him to start the season at left-back. You'd imagine now they've had a chance to sort out their defence. And, with players players returning from injury as well. So, I don't know, I just thought it was an interesting one, and that was one of the ones that just really stood out to me, because I'm definitely not going to go without Gabriel, because, again, you look at his non-penalty XGI there, 0.14 per 90. Actually, the majority of that, I think 0.13 is expected goals. So you're expecting a goal like every 7 to 8 games from him, which is just so much. And I think last year he scored 3 times. The season before, I think he scored 5 times. So he did actually kind of hit that number. Last year he was maybe a bit unlucky. But if he got lucky and just suddenly, he just managed to execute a couple of tricky headers and if luck's on his side, he's the kind of player who could just randomly score like 2 goals in 4 games or in games back to back like he is. So he's such a threat from set pieces. I think Gabriel and Estupiñán are probably locked in my team. Estupiñán for similar reasons, because I massively underestimated his expected minutes last year and I didn't have him. I had Dunk, and that was something I got massively wrong, given how much more attacking threat Estupiñán has. I just think his minutes are pretty safe, and he's so attacking, and he's 5. I don't know who have you got on your team at the moment, Ben, and where are you at with City defenders as well?
What was my first draft? It definitely had Gabriel, Estupiñán, Chilwell, a 4.0 defender, and Ruben Dias. Yeah, because.
Okay, so you potentially then, would you bench Chilwell in the first game week? Is that what you're thinking about doing, or is that 4 at the back?
That was benching him in the first week, I think, and playing my 6.5 midfielder with 3, so playing 3-5-2.
Yeah, nice. And one thing I would say is I just don't think, so Botman is obviously a really good price in general long term, but in my opinion their fixtures aren't good enough early to go for him. And particularly with the quality of some of those players we've already discussed, I just don't like the idea of having ultimately I'm rarely going to start him, so I don't like the idea of having that extra 0.5 on the bench. I'd rather just have a 4.0 player than Botman, because I don't want to start him regularly. The fixtures aren't good enough, and I don't want the extra 0.5 on my bench. But yeah, I added him to this table because he's popular, and I added Pedro Porro just because his attacking threat is so good. So at the moment, he's obviously got by far the lowest EV there, but that's based on 50 expected minutes. If people are really convinced that Porro is going to start every game, and his expected minutes are way higher than that, I think he's a real option as well. Just because he's so attacking.
Yeah, I agree. Fixtures are a bit mixed for Spurs, and we don't know what they're going to be like with the new manager. Are they going to be defensively more open, and they're going to be attacking more? 3 away games in the first 4, but they're fairly easy away games. But the home game is Man United, so it's a bit mixed. Yeah,
sure. Shall we move on to midfielders? Because I feel like there's a lot to discuss in terms of midfield. Goalkeeper's pretty straightforward. Defenders, I think there's probably we both think it's pretty straightforward in terms of 2 of them you can include, and then it's just whether you go for Chilwell or James, or whether you include a City defender. In fact, quickly to touch on City defenders. You mentioned you had Diaz. Is that just to do with minutes, Ben? Basically, you're more confident in his minutes over Stones, or
that's the case. I think he's the most nailed probably, but maybe it's just they've added Gvardiol, haven't they?
Yeah.
Does he threaten Ake the most? It's
definitely.
Gvardiol is a centre back who can play left back, same as Ake.
Yeah.
Who else have you got then? You've got Akanji, but he's not going to start every game. Then, yes, Stones. I suppose Stones is going to get more minutes in midfield if they've got two like left defenders like in Guardiola and Ake. So maybe that hints at Stones being the extra man in midfield more often.
Yeah.
So maybe Stones is worth a gamble. But how much is Stones? Is 5.5 as well, isn't
Yeah,
it?
they're the same price. Yeah.
And is Stones attacking data that much better if you got him up here? He's 0.12. He's a little bit better. And did he mention in a quote that he's getting forward more and he's...
Yeah, it's the fact he's just playing that midfield role, and that's what he's played in pre-season, I think. But yeah, I think what we saw last season with City was that their lineup in the Community Shield, I don't want to be quoted on this because I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it was identical to their lineup in Game Week 1. So I think in general that's probably, he's going to play his best team, and he's probably going to play his best team in the first game of the season, even though it's only Burnley, so to speak. Something that's interesting with Burnley that I remember Luke's mentioned before is that when they've played Burnley in the past, or when they've played teams that put a lot of long balls into the box, they often played Ake because of his height, but it's a completely different Burnley team. I think it's so easy to have this idea in your head of like Burnley are that kind of team, but they're now managed by Company. They play really good football. Like they said, that's not a consideration, I don't think, for that fixture. So I think basically Diaz is safer. You still expect Stones to play all the games, but maybe he might miss one of like the first 5, for example. So you basically just pay a little bit more for that attacking threat, which is improved with him in midfield. Sorry, you don't pay a little bit more. You take a bit more of a risk in terms of minutes to get that extra attacking threat, or you play it safe with Diaz, and that's where, if you go for James and Chilwell, probably go for Diaz again, so you don't get caught out. That's where maybe that kind of consideration we mentioned before might come in. But yeah, should we move on to midfielders?
Sure.
Because this is a big old table. So for anyone listening, we're looking at the same thing. Expected goals, expected assisted goals. This is all just based on last season for the midfielders. And again, their EV for game week 1 to 4 and game week 1 to 8. So what was the kind of main thing that stood out to you when you were kind of ran things through review last night, Ben?
It's just the Saka and the two United midfielders. They kind of like must-owns, aren't they? They're so good value and
Saka, like, particularly just was like, when I looked at it for the first 8 game weeks, he's got higher EV than Salah. And seeing Rashford not even that far behind Salah, that again immediately just made me rule out. I'm not going to try and squeeze Salah in, essentially.
Yeah.
But again, it's more to do with what we mentioned earlier about them being probably slightly too cheap. All those players, Saka, Rashford, Bruno, even Son, like they could easily be 10 million players and it would suddenly be way more interesting. But yeah, in terms of your midfield, are you looking to play 5 there, do you think? Because there's so many options.
Well, if you've got Chilwell as one of 4 good midfielders, and you have a 6.5 midfielder as your 5th mid, you might rotate and play 3-4-3 some weeks. No, 3-5-3 some weeks and 4. Sorry, I'm getting it wrong. But yeah, if you have 2 forwards, you're either going to be playing 3-5-2 or 4-4-2 and rotate your 5th midfielder. But there's lots of good value at 6.5, isn't there? But I don't know if if you want 2 of them, like the way the forwards, there's no 2 standout high-priced forwards that you want.
No.
And it's hard to find forwards at 7.5 and 8 now with the injuries that you might want to get 2 Arsenal and 2 Man United midfielders. Yeah,
it's not just that, isn't it? It's like the lack of those other options in terms of strikers, but also the fact that Jesus is now not an option. That's suddenly another Arsenal player. Most people then suddenly have 2 Arsenal players. So the obvious replacement is to bring in Martinelli or Odegaard. So again, that probably rules out having the 2 6.5 players. If you've got Bruno, Rashford, Saka, Martinelli or Odegaard, there's then room for 1. For me, I think I'm going to go for Martinelli and Saka. I think for that extra 0.5 you get from Martinelli, I think it's worth it. And again, it's just, I think there's a lot of people are worried about Martinelli being rotated. That's now less of a worry because of Jesus being out, because that has a knock-on effect with, Martinelli could play in that position or another player plays in that position. And that's one of the players who might have been subbed on for Martinelli or might have started instead of him. But I also think in general, there's not really a big minutes risk with Martinelli that maybe a lot of people think there is. Any conversation I've had with an Arsenal fan, They've just like it's just obvious to them that Martinelli's first choice on that left wing. Whereas I think it's maybe a bit of a FPL Twitter thing that we are suddenly really concerned that he's going to be a rotation risk. And so I think particularly with Jesus now, I'm just willing to take that risk because I think the upside of Martinelli is so much higher than Ødegaard. And I do wonder whether Havertz playing will mean that Ødegaard plays slightly deeper. But that's just speculation. I think we'll probably find that out as well. So yeah, my thought process is to have Martinelli and Saka. I think Rashford and Bruno, I think are no-brainers now, to be honest. Just because of their prices. I think Bruno, particularly because he has penalties. I may even prefer Bruno over Rashford, in fact, for the fact he's on penalties and still attacking. And I think it's also exciting that Son is 9 and they've made him a lot cheaper and in line with these other midfielders as well. Because later in the season, I think he'll become an option as well. Yeah, and do you have similar thoughts with regards to Arsenal, Ben, or do you? And would you even go with 2 Arsenal? If you actually think there's more value in the 6.5s, despite Arsenal having amazing fixtures, now Jesus is out, would you end up consider the possibility of actually just having 2 of them?
With one defender and one...
Yeah, just Gabriel and Saka.
Yeah, that is definitely an option as well.
Feels weird though, doesn't it?
Depends, when we talk about forwards, if you go down to one of the 5 or 5.5 forwards, then you can use the extra funds to go up to Salah or Trent, and then you do have a cheaper midfield, and I don't know.
Yeah, it's definitely worth thinking about, at least because it feels so weird to go without to only go with 2 players when Arsenal are probably the second best team in the league and they've got amazing fixtures. Feels weird, but actually sometimes those things do make sense in the context of the team. And you mentioned before the good 6.5 options. The 5 I've put on here are March, Mitoma, Eze, and Mbeumo, and I've actually added Diaby as well, who's a new signing. Just because his underlying data is so good. I think he signed from Ligue 1, I can't remember which team.
He's Villa, isn't he?
Yeah, Aston Villa. Yeah, and he's fairly high in review, and his heart because of that kind of previous really good attacking data. Out of those 5, or is there any, which ones do you like the most? And is there someone I'm missing on that list, do you think?
I don't think out of the 6.5s, I think you've covered them. Who did we like? And Mbeumo is the one on FPL review stands out, and
yeah,
I agree with that. But without Tony, is he going to be as good? He's had quite a good pre-season, hasn't he?
Yeah, he has.
But Brentford going to be able to form attacks in the same way. They had a really good partnership in the Premier League, Tony and Mbeumo. But I still think he's good value. He's playing up front. He's cheap, and the fixtures are decent. That you can't really go wrong with it. Mbeumo.
Yeah, I think and it's easy to say, he'll be really good because when Tony was out last season, he went on a good scoring run, but it's just such a small sample. And again, we just don't know what that's going to look like long term. But yeah, just the fact he's on penalties and he's playing for Brentford, who are one of the better teams, and the fact that he's only 6.5, it just I think that's a good way of putting it. There's kind of not a lot to lose because ultimately he's only cost you 6.5, and you're probably then getting a better striker, or you're putting money elsewhere because of it. So yeah, I agree. And then particularly now seeing the data from, I liked Mbeumo anyway, but now seeing the data from review, where he's 37 predicted EV for the first 8 game weeks, the same as Ødegaard, that just makes him a no-brainer at that price for me. And I think I might like to only have him from the 6.5s for the reasons I mentioned earlier. Diaby's probably one to keep an eye on. Eze, review really likes. I'm not as keen on Eze, I don't think. He's on penalties, which is really good, and obviously the same price as Mbeumo. But I just don't like their opening fixtures quite as much. Just because he's got Arsenal in his second game, maybe puts me off him slightly, and makes me think that's more of a wait and see. So yeah, I'm not as sure on Eze. And then I think Mitoma and March are pretty similar, aren't they? Review slightly prefers March. even with Mitoma having higher X-Mins.
Yeah, it's hard to pick between those two, I think. Yeah, you just can flip a coin on them, really, I suppose. But I think I prefer Mbomo if I'm just going to have one. And we could get more of them on a wild card later if you wanted to have more expensive players like Salah and Trent, and you might be leaning on more of those, but maybe just pick one at the minute.
Yeah, definitely. I think Nakamba as well, who's signed for... is he also Villa? He seems to be the best 4.5 option as well, from what I've looked at as well.
Didn't he go to Brentford? Not Brentford, Luton.
Luton, that's it, yeah. But
he was on loan from Villa, and
that's it.
Now he's permanently...
Can't remember at the top of my head, but again, that's based on pre-season. He's started regularly and been reasonably attacking. So if you're going to go down a completely different route and have 4 midfield, he's probably the one to go for, based on what I've read. But I just don't think that's really a consideration for most people, to be honest. Most people are going for 5 midfielders now in either a 3-5-2 basically. I think 3.3-4-3 has kind of died a death really since the forwards have been injured. I was on that for a while with Haaland, Jesus and Nkunku, which is obviously probably 2 of those out of the 3 won't play now in the first game week, so we'll see. But yeah, I would really particularly with the Arsenal guys, I would really encourage Martinelli over Odegaard. Personally, for me, that's just my read on the minutes based on conversations. And I just think, although I think the prices overall are way too low, I think actually in terms of these midfielders compared to other players, I think it's only Saka they've got really wrong. I think he should be more expensive. I think it should be more like Saka at 9 to 9.5, Martinelli and Odegaard the same price at like 8.5 in reality. So that's why Saka's even more of a no-brainer. And it's going to be weird starting a season without Salah, to be honest.
Yeah, and I think with Martinelli, he'll start to get subbed off more when he's more fatigued, when the Champions League starts coming out.
Sure.
Coming every midweek, but Champions League doesn't start until the midweek in game week 5. So he should be playing mostly 90 mins or 85 mins if he's sharp.
Yes. Yeah. Shall we move on to forwards, and then we'll just do some questions to finish after that?
Yeah.
So in terms of forwards, I don't think there's a lot to discuss here. Well, there are a few key things to discuss, but just not a lot of players to discuss, I guess. So again, same graphic. Obviously, Haaland's way out on top. I don't think there's any justification for not having Haaland. I think I'm glad they increased his price because it will decrease the ownership slightly, but I do really wish he was they kind of put the boat out and made him 15, for example, rather than 14 to make it a proper conversation. I guess on this graphic I've kept Nkunku in it just because we don't know the extent of his injuries, because we know at the time of recording this that we know that he felt something in his knee and was therefore removed and is being assessed. So for all we know, it's a false alarm and he'll play game week 1. So I've kept him in for that reason. Jesus has been ruled out for a few weeks, so we know we're just not going to go with him in game week 1. So it's Haaland plus 1, maybe plus 2 others. Who kind of stands out to you here, Ben? Is there the obvious answer that I think there is?
But it was Nkunku before the issue. So what's the obvious answer now? Is it Watkins, do you think?
I think it is, but I don't know. Maybe you maybe disagree. I just think...
No, I agree. It's just trying to shuffle around the budget so that...
Yeah.
Because I could afford the 7.5 when I made my team last night with Martinelli, Saka, the 2 Man United midfielders, and Burmo, and then I had a 4.5 and a 4 in goal, and then you've got to downgrade somewhere in defence to get the extra money for Watkins.
Yeah, you've got to either... I think this is the decision for me at this stage, is either having Watkins as my second striker or going for a cheap second striker like Visser or Pedro, for example, and then having a better first sub and having Chilwell, for example, which is probably the wiser thing to do, but I just don't know if I trust Visser or... Pedro's getting a lot of talk at the moment as an option, and he's played a bit in pre-season, but in my opinion, early on, it's just too much of a risk. Because he's competing with Ferguson, with Welbeck, with Mitoma, with March. Lallana's played in pre-season even. They've got Gross. In Cisco is it as well. There's just so many attacking players, and so many players can play in general across the attackers in different positions. I feel like I'm not willing to go there. I'm not yet convinced I'm willing to go there because of also just how good Watkins is, which is why at the moment my thought process is that I'll have a just really cheap subs that have two that I know play at 4.0 in terms of defenders, but just going to take a bit of a gamble on shallow squad depth so I can get Watkins in because he's so nailed, and the fact he's on penalties, really good underlying data as well, 0.3 XG per 90, non-penalty last season. And I just think, like Darwin and Gakpo, for me, again, I'm just not confident on who will start enough to take a gamble there early on. But no, you actually mentioned Alvarez to me.
I did. I was going to say that
earlier, which I think
he's turning 24 in January, so it's his second year in Pep's system. Maybe he's got plans to use him more this year with Mahrez going out and Gundogan. Maybe he's going to get more minutes, and we've got the Community Shield, and we might get leaked team news for the Game Week 1 game. So if he's starting both of those games in a row, then he could be a serious option. He's a quality player, isn't he?
Yeah, he is. He's so good.
Yeah.
And it's the fact that he could... I guess it could be like De Bruyne and Alvarez played together, which we saw a little bit at the end of last season. Because early in the season, it was either De Bruyne or Alvarez. When Alvarez, he always came in for De Bruyne and played like behind Haaland. This is when Haaland was fit. Whereas I think last season there was a game where all three played, and maybe we saw that a few times towards the end. I'd need Luke to remind me, to be honest. But yeah, when he's on the pitch, he's really good. It just feels like a big risk, but it's going to be so tempting if he does play in the Community Shield. I think based on a brief conversation I had with Luke yesterday, he thinks there's like a good chance he'll play 2 out of the first 3, for example. But he'll provide more insight on that next week. And you really depressed me when you told me that he's only 23, because he's 23 years old and he's already won a treble and a World Cup. That's unbelievable. I think 23, I couldn't even get into my uni football team. He's. I don't think I can bring myself to go there, and I think this is a similar position to like. It's kind of what we discussed around keepers. Actually, is you can't really go that wrong if you just like obviously Haaland, but with the second option is either Watkins or a cheap one, and then a better first sub probably. I think that's the reality of it personally, but I don't know. Jackson could be interesting. I've not put a lot of thought into him. I know a lot of people had him even before Nkunku was injured. So if he was a genuine option then, and now Nkunku's injured, maybe I should be considering him more, and that might be somewhere I need to do a bit more looking into. He's got the asterisk next to his data there if you're watching. And that's just to show that data's from a different league, which is why it's also by Nkunku and Pedro as well, just in case anyone was wondering. But yeah, so he was playing La Liga last season, and 0.45 XG, non-penalty XG per 90s, pretty mad.
Yeah, he's looking at his transfer market page. He went on a massive scoring run at the end of the year, so I think that's why Chelsea signed him. It's like goal, 2 goals, goal, 2 goals. Like every game, he's getting 1 or 2 attacking contributions just on a really hot run last season.
But that's also the reason why when Nkunku was fit, I was so willing to just pay the 0.5 for Nkunku, because Nkunku's been doing that for like 2 or 3 seasons, scoring like 30 goals a season. So there's just way more assurance, and I think his minutes were way higher compared to Jackson. But Jackson, it's a similar type of gamble in terms of judging how well he'll transition to the league. Particularly for someone like me, I just don't watch a lot of football outside of England at all. So it's just going to like look at the numbers and just I'm willing to take a gamble on that he'll be able to do that. But also just trying to judge the minutes. That's the tricky thing.
Yeah, I suppose if Nkunku's injury is serious, then it definitely opens up Jackson as an option.
Yeah.
But if it's only a small, like a doubtful kind of thing, then it makes it hard to go for either of them.
Yeah. I think so the only players now we've not discussed are Vissa, who I don't think is an option now, to be honest, because we know like Mbeumo is on penalties and he's not, and again because of minutes. But I think Calvert-Lewin is like a genuine consideration and will be at times this season. But I think with his recent return for injury, I probably wouldn't go there. But those, I can see why people would do it with those first 4 fixtures particularly. I can see why he might be interesting. Don't know, did you have anything else to add on forwards, Ben, or did you want to move on to a few questions to finish?
No, we can move on to the questions now.
Great, let me get those up. And I'll change this so you can see both of us. Great. So I think some of these questions are probably directed specifically at you, Ben. People are very excited that you're on our podcast. Seb's asked us a question, which I find really funny. I'm going to ask him a question next week and make it really difficult. So Andy FPL Mode says, who are your favourite 3 Arsenal players for game week 1 now that Jesus is out? So in 3 words, who would you go for?
We've been discussing this. It's Gabriel, Saka and Martinelli.
Yes, I agree with that. But I can see justification for Odegaard as well. Seb's question was actually, how much weight do you place on flexibility versus planning out a strategy for the first few weeks? How important is having a rough idea of first wildcard usage to this? We've discussed that briefly already, but I guess like in general, I suppose a good question then is, do you have like a specific time frame you like to have in mind? For example, Ben, when you used review last night, did you set it up for 8 game weeks like I did? Or do you think that's too long or too short, and would you just go for 12?
I set it up for 8 game weeks as well. You don't need to look too much beyond there, I suppose. But wildcarding, you can be flexible with that early on. I suppose you don't want to take too many risks early and have to wildcard in game week 3. You want enough data to build up like 4 or 5 weeks worth of data before you can play an effective wildcard. So you just want to be like have a settled team for those like first 5 weeks or whatever, and then just get into the swing of things as the season goes. It just things change and you just go along with it. You can sometimes think the template is so strong early on, but it gradually shifts over the year, and there's always something interesting happening. Yeah,
for sure. I agree with that completely. And what we said at the beginning of the podcast as well in relation to that. At FPL Noble Gent, how do you feel the new ruling around stoppage time will affect FPL? You're the perfect person to ask, Ben, because I know you already looked into kind of how this might impact things and what players it might impact, or you've considered it at least.
I did consider it. So what are they thinking? You could get like 9 or 10 minutes in games occasionally. I mean, in the World Cup, remember the England-Iran game? That was like an outlier. You got like 15 minutes of stoppage, but how many more stoppage times on average? Could it be like 2 or 3 minutes on average really at the start of the years?
I think it's more like to be like an extra 5 or 6 minutes on average, to be honest.
On average, that's
I think
a lot.
so.
So that is significant. So that's why I looked at the players who don't get subbed off, because they get the full extra 5 minutes on average to the expected minutes, whereas the people who get subbed off in like half the games or more than half the games, they're not going to get those extra minutes. So it benefits those players. I made the graphic. I did a little bit of research, didn't I? Let's try and find it. It definitely helps Bruno Fernandes, because he never got subbed off.
Yeah.
It's kind of the obvious ones like Harry Kane and I don't know, the defensive midfielders who we're going to ignore, but like Maddison's becomes a good option. Ollie Watkins as well, it boosts him. He didn't get subbed off much at all.
Any penalty takers, I guess, as well. Just 5 minutes on the pitch, even if they're not doing anything in that 5 minutes. It's just an extra 5 minutes where your team might win a penalty and you're on the pitch to take it. But with it's also more time for teams to concede. But it's that thing of like, I think it is like a little bit significant, because ultimately if it does turn out to be like an extra 5 minutes per match, that is interesting. But it's whether then coaches start to make subs 5 minutes later as well, and for that reason.
Well, you're into kind of sports science and stuff. Some players can only last like 60 or so minutes, can't they?
It's more decisions made on minutes. Well, it's a mixture. Quite often, if a player's returning from injury, are very set decisions made on minutes. So 45 or 60 minutes, for example, would be quite common. Whereas with other players, they play it a bit more by ear and they see how they're looking on the pitch, or talk to them at half-time about how they're feeling. So it depends on the player. But yeah, my instinct would be that particularly initially it wouldn't impact when teams make subs, particularly because a lot of those subs are naturally tactical anyway. They're as much to do with tactics as well as fitness, and so they're going to happen when they need to happen. But it's just whether it's just actually, even though it might have an impact, it's actually whether it's a measurable impact that's going to will actually impact who we choose. Probably not, particularly if like review's going to take that into account, which it will in terms of its data and minutes as well, in terms of players. So yeah, so I think it will make a difference, but maybe not enough difference for it to be the difference between us buying 2 players. That's kind of my general take on it.
Okay.
Yeah, do you think the same, or do you think it could actually be a difference maker?
Well, like I was saying, it depends if you just look at the minutes that review's got, and if you judge them as being fair, you might want to up the minutes. You might think you might be ahead of the curve on it and just give players like Watkins a few more minutes. Like players like Bruno Fernandes, he's in our drafts, whatever, so it doesn't really matter about him. But I do think it helps certain players a little bit more.
Yeah,
but,
yeah. It's definitely interesting. It'd be really interesting to see how it plays out as well. I was chatting to James, a guy who's I can't remember what his Twitter handle is now off the top of my head, but really into analytics. And I was chatting to him about it, and he thinks that it will be similar to what happened at the World Cup, where it was implemented really heavily early on, and actually referees actually got less strict on it and reduced it because obviously it annoyed people. But I think in principle it's a good thing in terms of ultimately more time being added on for players' time wasting and the ball being out of play. Guppy FPL says best City defenders to own. Let's skip past that one just because we've already answered it. Jack FPL_Jack, how did Luke and Sam convince you to join them on the pod? And probably more interestingly, what made you decide to use analytics more in your approach to FPL last season?
I joined the pod because I bumped into you in Birmingham in game week 39. We had a good chat, and you seemed like nice lads, and I just
we charmed you basically.
Yeah, and then what was the other question?
What made you mentioned actually already that you used analytics more last season. Like, what made you do that and like explore that a bit more?
Because I noticed like the best managers in the world, they're using analytics, like the ones who are consistently getting good results and whose opinions I trust, are using review more. And I suppose it's like every year from like 5 or 6 years ago, I've just got gradually more and more into just doing my own research into analytics, using Pro Football Ref or FBref or whatever.
Yeah.
Just getting more and more into it. Always.
Yeah.
Just finding the good information sources and relying on them more than your own opinion. But I don't think I've drastically changed how I play over the years.
And I think a lot of people are really good when it comes to watching football or just looking at stats, and they're just really good at applying that in their heads, and they know what they're looking for, etc. I think I find review helpful because I can look at the underlying data and see who's got the best defence or attacking threat, but I struggle to, in my head, put that into the context of minutes, for example. So just the fact that kind of quantifies it for me and gives me a figure I find useful. And then it's what I mentioned earlier about it being just a really unbiased, like objective opinion on your team. And it might just rule out something you're trying to do that's really stupid, or make you consider a player that you might not have even considered before, and suddenly you look into them a bit more. For me, it's that. In fact, the question wasn't asked to me, but I just wormed my way in. I'm just going to find a couple more. Okay, in one word, or in a sentence, do you think Nketiah or Trossard are options?
Depends on Jesus's injury, but if he's out long term, then I think Nketiah could be.
Yeah, because
he played a lot under Nketiah's out. When Jesus was injured last year, I think Nketiah did well, but yeah, depends on the injury.
It's just like not being. It's just not for game week 1, in my opinion, because we just can't be confident enough on that yet that he's going to be. Particularly having they've just signed Havertz. It could so easily just be Havertz that plays there, and then you have Nketiah, something that's a striker spot used up and an Arsenal spot used up with a player who's not starting. But I agree. I also agree with you on Trossard, like you said. I agree with you on Trossard that it's more Nketiah that might become an option rather than him. Even though Trossard's actually scored quite a few in pre-season, I just think from conversations with Arsenal fans that it's Martinelli, Saka are definitely the first choice on the wings. One word answer, Foden or Martinelli?
Martinelli.
Same, I agree. let me just go to the initial tweet and see if there's any questions on there. Here we go. This is interesting. There's a why does Pingu's mum iron even though none of them wear any clothes? It's actually a really good question. Maybe it's to do with gender stereotypes of women still existing amongst children's cartoons around penguins. Something like that. That's the deep answer. It's a very good question. Where's Luke? Luke will be here next week with Seb. I suppose. I think we've answered all the questions now that didn't come up in the podcast like previously, and that's kind of a good segue into. So in general, how the podcast will work is it will be two of us each week. So this week it's me and Ben. Then it will be Luke and Seb next week, and it just depends on our availability. I think it'll be quite often be me and one of the other three guys. You'll be disappointed to hear. But in general, it'll be a mixture, and we might even trial later in the season having like three of us or even more, four of us on one episode if we fancy branching out as well. Is there anything else to cover, Ben? I guess the only thing we've not covered is captaincy for game week 1. I'm sure Luke and Seb will discuss that next week, but do you have the bottle to go against Haaland in game week 1?
I don't think so. What about you?
I like to think that I do. But I don't know, it's just the idea of Haaland scoring a hat-trick in the first day and you've not even you're miles behind before even the first Saturday of the first game week is painful. But I think there's actually quite a big difference on review, so I actually think I might go for it. I might just go for Saka in the first game week and just back Burnley. I think I'm probably going to just be a slave to review and just go for it.
The feel will set in more like the day before
exactly.
the deadline. It's kind of easy to say it now, but
yeah,
wait to see how you feel.
Absolutely, yeah. And there's other things to consider in terms of minutes and all sorts. I'm for sure I'll try and find an excuse not to captain Haaland. I'll find a way to find a bit of confirmation bias to make me do it. So I also wanted to say big thanks to FPL Captain on Twitter, who's a guy called Chris, who's helped us out massively with getting all our graphics together. So I really appreciate that. Thanks to Review as well. I was going to say his name then, but I don't know if his name is public, so I won't. But the person who runs FPL Review, he works so tirelessly to get that website together. And it for me, I know a lot of people who are skeptics of analytics think that it makes the game more boring. I think it's really interesting and makes the game more exciting, and he does an incredible job. So massive thanks to him and for letting us share this data as well within the podcast, which he gives us permission to do. So we appreciate that. Tune in to Seb and Luke next week. That'll be the evening before the first game week. And thanks for joining as well, Ben, and for joining the podcast this season. I'm sure people will be looking forward to hearing what you have to say for the rest of the season.
Okay, thanks for having me. It's been good.
Pleasure. Thanks, everyone. Have a good game week 1.